There is so much I want to talk to Dr. Heather Sutherland about. It's difficult to know quite where to begin. Heather is a lecturer in the School of Education, Language and Psychology at St John's University in York, where her research and work focuses on better understanding the issues around student mental health and mental health more widely across academic institutions. But she didn't start out in the field of mental health research. She started out as a historian, and her first PhD actually involved studying BBC comedy from the 70s and 80s. But it was the death of her brother Martin to suicide in 2011 which set Heather on her current career path.
I suppose if I'm kind of looking at it now from the 13-year point, I would like suicide loss to not be still a key feature of my life, but I don't think suicide loss gives you the choice. So I read a comment from a post on social media from another person who lost their sibling to suicide, who said it had become the wallpaper of their life. And that made a lot of sense to me, because it's always in the background. It's a continuous exposure, but it might not necessarily be in your face, but it's always kind of there.
Just before we get underway, a reminder, these conversations are often difficult and can be upsetting. If you need support, please do press pause and get some help. You'll find all the contact details for Mikey's line in the show notes. I'm Penny Stewart, and this is Speaking of Suicide. Heather, Martin's death has clearly had a profound impact on your life. When I was talking to you ahead of this recording, you said it's not a lived experience when you lose someone to suicide, it's a living experience, which I thought was quite an interesting thing to hear from you. Let's dig into what you meant by that.
I think I'm still trying to understand it myself in many ways, because I think I mean that navigating suicide loss and understanding its implications for me personally will always remain an ongoing kind of learning process. I will never have lived my experience because I will never stop living it across the remainder of my life. And the meaning of the loss of my brother will change as I continue to live that loss. I never really got to say goodbye, and he didn't say it to me. And so our relationship, albeit in different forms, goes on. So it's still a living thing to me in many ways. So when I first heard the term lived experience coming more to the fore, particularly in research circles, I was like, yes, finally recognition that experience has a strength in providing valuable knowledge and all the rest of it. But as more time has kind of passed, it seems to me like lived experience is something to be approached as almost done, dusted, boxed up, organised, finished, and it's in the past. But for me, there are the kind of the experience that I've had is more that there are further losses that result from the first one that you don't really realise you're even going to have until they happen. So, for example, not being able to introduce my daughter to her uncle, things like this. So as silly as it sounds, coming to realise things like, I'm even quite wary now already of the possibility of reaching the point where I will have lived more years without my brother than with him in the world. Yes, that's 14 years away, but it's on my radar every year as I age. So it's kind of a presence of a loss that just continues and takes shape in different ways as I go along. There are moments when aspects of you kind of feeling, oh, I've conquered that part of the bereavement process, or I've conquered that bit of pain, comes back unexpectedly, and you didn't even realise that it wasn't conquered. So things like I scattered my brother's ashes at Sycamore Gap. So the felling was like a sudden flash in the face of, oh, actually, maybe there's bits of this experience that I'm still not okay with when I thought I was. And there's coming to that realisation that you just don't and you can't get over or move on from a loss like this. And you develop new patterns in your grief across time as you come to know when are the days and the times of the year that are hardest for you. There is not a morning when Martin, or the fact that he did die by suicide, doesn't come into my mind. When major events like COVID-19 or even little things happen in the news, I would want to know what he thinks about them, or I would want to talk to him about them. But then you realise that you can't. So you realise that your experience is living.
I find that fascinating because it's just not a way I've heard it framed in any of these conversations before. And that idea of not actually having said goodbye, of not having that relationship ended in that way, and it continuing in different ways and different dimensions is, it's a really interesting way of thinking about it. We're going to come back to all this kind of stuff, I know. Sorry, go on.
I think it's just interesting to me, particularly maybe as a sibling, that an experience like this it can put you in a very liminal, uncertain place. I don't have any other brothers and sisters, so I'm constantly having to revise and question my identity in terms of things like, am I a sister or am I not? And how do I feel in a different day? And do I want to talk about this or do I not? And when you're constantly revisiting these types of questions, it isn't a lived, concluded experience.
I mean, Martin's death was clearly a pivotal point in your life and has informed so much of what's gone on since then. Maybe you could tell me a bit more about him, Heather, and how and when he took his life, because that was such a key moment, clearly.
Well, thank you for asking, to be honest. It's quite nice to get asked. I don't talk about my brother a lot in terms of who he was, just because time passes, but also it can be hard to do so because I do doubt some of my own memories sometimes. I did lose a lot of memories and things. So there's kind of also that realisation that after someone dies in this way, one person is known in different ways by different people, and they mean different things to different people. So I go a lot on how I feel about him in the moment and things like that. So my general impression of my brother was, he's just a brilliant person, very brilliant mind. I will get upset because I don't go here a lot. Okay. So give me a minute. But he was my friend as well as my brother. He was an absolute pain on more than one occasion. Seemed to like winding me up a lot, calling me Feather instead of Heather, which drove me crazy.
So your younger brother?
Yes, 3 years and 3 days. But he was perhaps the most, the person I trusted most, and the person that I was perhaps most myself with. He was irritatingly clever, a very big thinker, a very philosophical mind, a history buff, massive reader and a wordsmith, a particular fan of John Steinbeck, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but definitely not Dickens.
It almost sounds like he was someone you looked up to,
yeah.
although he was younger than you, which is an interesting way round.
I mean, he was just so thoughtful, really able to articulate things that in a way that I could never do. I just really admired him a lot. He was really funny, but to the point of having really sharp humour at times make you go, "Ooh, I would never say something like that, but you can." Everybody around us knows him as a very expert musician. He was a brilliant guitarist, which I didn't personally appreciate whilst trying to revise for my A-levels through the bedroom wall. So we had particular yelling events for that, but there was no kind of denying his musical gift, and he would absolutely slate my musical tastes because he knew best when it came to music. I know he liked football, but that wasn't something that we shared. But what we did share was a lot of love for movies. So he would send me plot summaries by text, which were just the highlight of a day sometimes because they were so to the point. So,
Did
for
you have a
example,
favourite?
like,
Did you
well,
have a
there's a
favourite
couple.
shared one?
There was a few about Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, which are a bit too long, and I can't even say them because you'd need to see them. But he loved the Kate Winslet and Christopher Eccleston version of Jude, like the obscure the movie.
Yeah.
So his text on that one was, "Jude loves Sue, Sue loves Jude. Therein lies problems," and that was it. It was really nice, just to get them every now and again.
So,
But as a sister as well, he was really kind of roll your eyes weird at times, very eccentric. So wearing slippers like you might want shoes. He wanted a Christmas tree up for his birthday when he was a child, and his birthday's in August. But my
okay.
parents actually did put a Christmas tree up for his birthday. So there was things like that. I very much disapproved of his smoking, so we'd bicker over that and have heated conversations about things like the smoking ban that came in when it did. But yeah, 3 years, 3 days younger than me, I was massively protective of him. And I never had it impressed upon me to look after your brother and all the rest of it. But I think because of the closeness of birthdays and things like that, I just wanted to look after him.
Which immediately makes me think that if you're protecting your younger brother, then the shock of his taking his life when you've seen it as your role to care for him,
Yeah,
must have been profound.
well, yeah, because it's not. There was a big build-up, really. There was many years of mental distress that went on before, most of which I have to acknowledge was witnessed by my parents, because it was across years once I had subsequently left to go to university. And then later when I moved abroad, it was sort of clear to me that his sort of mental experience, I don't want to say state because it's not fixed, but his experience sort of deteriorated when he did move to university and he started to become socially anxious. And I used to leave my phone on in the night time, and he did quite frequently call 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, struggling to sleep and things like that. So yeah, he did have a diagnosis of treatment-resistant depression, and he tried a few medications, some therapy type stuff, but and a lot of that detail is known more by my parents, but from the feeling of it from afar, it's that kind of, from my point of view, seeing him grow increasingly frustrated, angry with himself, that he wanted to change but he couldn't, and he couldn't see how. But also from my point of view, that I knew he was suffering, but literally had no idea how to help. I struggled with my own mental health as a teenager, and did share some of the things that, when he asked how did you handle this, or what do I do in this, and I would share what I had done, but it never worked in the same way for him. It just didn't seem to click. So yeah.
So he'd clearly had struggles for, as you say, a prolonged time. That doesn't mean that any of us can ever be prepared for someone taking their life.
It was not on my radar. I knew his struggling, and I didn't know what to do, and I knew it was hard for all of us to carry, I think, and he was aware of his. I think he had a sense of himself as potentially being a problem, which we always would say it's not. You're not a burden. Because I was living in Mexico when I was about to get married, and I hadn't heard from him for quite a while, and I was concerned he didn't reply to messages as he had done and all the rest of it. And he phoned me on the 20th of October in 2011, and said he was worried he would ruin my wedding if he came to it. And I said directly to him that he'd ruin if he wasn't there. And he came, and he flew out to the wedding, and I know it was difficult. I got to tell him at that point that he was going to be an uncle, because at that time I was pregnant. And we had a good day out at Chichen Itza. I got married in Mexico, so that perhaps explains that part. And that was the last day I saw him in person. But just about 6 weeks later, I was going through a miscarriage, and then my parents called on the 15th of December to tell me that he had taken his own life. And that was not even close to anything I had thought would impact my life.
So at that point, you've got, real compounded grief. Mm-hmm. You've got grief of the loss of a child at the same time as grief of the loss of your brother.
Yeah.
In some respects, I don't know if we can separate the two, or whether even we should. But what form did your grief for him take? What sort of shape? How did it play out?
So I think it's really difficult. I'm not sure if it has a shape or just identifiable features that I can pick out. And that whole period is very much a mesh of lots of things together. So shock and disbelief is clearly one of the first ones. And I couldn't really process it to begin with because of the miscarriage. I was detached because of the geographical distance. I was on the other side of the world, and because of my health situation, I wasn't able to fly home straight away. When I was able to fly home, I did actually hallucinate my brother in Dallas airport and started to follow someone, because I really thought it was my brother whilst I was on that journey. And I had to kind of catch myself. No, you're in the middle of America. He's not in Dallas airport. And it was quite a strong kind of experience for that, sitting on a plane for 12 hours. I think it's probably the only long haul plane flight where I've slept the whole way, because of the intensity of kind of all the emotional stuff that was going on. So I did arrive at home just before Christmas. There was the funeral just before New Year, but I ended up in A&E with the miscarriage continuing the day after the funeral, before then flying back out to Mexico, week off work, straight back into teaching. So a lot of it was not really, I wasn't feeling it. I wasn't connecting with my grief at that point. I was literally just carrying on and trying to kind of deal with the physical fallouts of both of them. I did struggle to concentrate. Was finding reading difficult. What I did experience after I got back to Mexico, what I did experience was a lot of nightmares.
I wonder, Heather, do you think we spend enough time talking and listening to these kinds of experiences about bereavement? Because I almost think it's something that we turn away from, because witnessing someone else's pain is something that's incredibly hard. And I wonder if bereavement falls into this category of we, in the immediate aftermath, there's the outpouring of grief and sympathy and empathy, but then I wonder if we turn away as a society from it slightly, and don't continue these conversations about what bereavement looks and feels like over a longer period of time. I might be wrong. Maybe there are discussions about it, but I don't feel like I come across it.
Absolutely not. We don't go into detail. We don't think about sort of grief in terms of long term. We think about you get through funerals, you get through. There's a lot. I didn't even know that a coroner thing formed part of this type of loss. There's a lot of learning about process and formalities and all of that kind of stuff that you have to confront whilst you're also trying to make sense of complete disorientation emotionally. So no, there isn't enough engagement, and there's also not a recognition of personal capacity. You do need someone to step in and take for you and guide you, rather than putting responsibility on the person to figure it out for themselves, because they can't necessarily express what they're feeling. They don't have the language. It's a nonsensical experience in the first days, and you need a long period of time to even approach being able to make a story of it. And I think the making a story of it is not to organize it, but it's part of, we make sense of things through stories. And whilst you're in a lot of different facets of an experience, you can't link them together at the time. So you need to be able to make sense through the story at a later time. You don't know what the impacts are in the moment. And I think for me, my bereavement has kind of evolved a lot in many respects. So I suppose if I'm kind of looking at it now from the 13-year point, I would like suicide loss to not be still a key feature of my life, but I don't think suicide loss gives you the choice. So I read a comment from a post on social media from another person who lost their sibling to suicide, who said it had become the wallpaper of their life. And that made a lot of sense to me, because it's always in the background. It's a continuous exposure, but it might not necessarily be in your face, but it's always kind of there. And you're riding a continuous wave, and its pattern can kind of shift direction without warning, and you just have to go with it. Fighting any waves that hit when they do doesn't work, is exhausting, and pretending that they're not happening is not helpful. I've had multiple kind of phases where I've needed some counselling, some different types of therapy, but the one that made the most impact was EMDR, because I struggled a lot with the visual side of it rather than anything else. So I needed some help. But even there, part of gaining access to that was I had to go private, because the GPs at that stage weren't really aware of the kind of the traumatic grief side of things. And the private practitioner that I was with said, yes, you do meet the threshold for PTSD. But that didn't sit well with me, because I was like, yeah, post-traumatic stress, but I have never felt disordered in my response to the experience. It feels entirely logical to me that I experience trauma as a result of this, but I'm not disordered as a result of it. And that's part of the bereavement conversation that I do think is missing as well, that it's not about the type of event, it's about the reaction after in many ways.
Heather, I want to come on and talk about your academic work in just a second, but let's pause while I give out the Mikey's Line details. If you're listening to this and it's striking a chord and you need someone to talk to, then you can text Mikey's Line on 07786 20 77 55, or you can contact them via Messenger, web chat and WhatsApp. The number for WhatsApp is 01463 729 000. You can also go and visit them if you're in the Highlands at the Hive, 4 Strothers Lane, Inverness. They're open 7 days a week from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. and all of those details and links are in the show notes, of course. Heather, Martin, your brother's death by suicide was significant in the academic route you took subsequently. Just before we look at the specific research you did, I wanted to quote something back at you from your PhD, which you let me have a look at, about Martin. And in it you said, of particular significance is the relationship I viewed between my brother's mental distress and his experiences of academic settings. Although not registered as a student at the time of his death, he had deferred his studies for a year. Martin's connection with UK higher education and his student identity are to me significant elements in the with hindsight roadmap to his passing. My brother appeared to regard his mental state as an inhibitor to his potential as a student. Now, there's a lot in there, but what did you see as being the significance in Martin's relationship with the academic setting and his relationship with his viewing himself as a student?
So for me, it kind of is worth talking big level in many ways. We have an academic system which encourages from a very early age a sense of self that's intertwined with academic performance. So in many ways, your grade is you. It's an identity feature. So academia is not something that you just do. For many people, it's powerful and meaning in terms of how they understand themselves. So both Martin and myself, we went to grammar schools. University was kind of a natural progression, part of us before we got there, which is not necessarily a bad thing when it feels natural, but it can lead to a question of, if I'm not academic or if I'm not doing academia in some way, what else am I? What can I do? Who else am I? And I do believe that Martin had very high academic standards for himself as kind of identity markers, as it were. So success at university was very symbolic for him as a person. So, I mean, undertaking a second thesis was not something I did on a whim. It's not something you do for fun. And I did it in large part for him because he was offered a place to do a PhD, which he was unable to take up because of his mental health and his mental distress levels. So in a way, Martin should have been the doctor. He was the one more deserving of that title. So my doing the project was in large part for me to honour him, understanding that him not being able to do that was really mentally harmful for him. It meant he was some kind of failure, which obviously wasn't the case. But such was the power of the academic sense of self for him. I think that's my perception on that way.
And I'm interested in whether that extends to a lot of other people. I suspect it might. We'll come on to that in a second, but maybe before we do, you could just tell us a bit about how you pivoted to decide to research in this area and what it was you decided to do. What was that PhD focused on?
So my PhD was focused on student mental health and well-being, part of a larger project. But within that, I wanted to do a qualitative project, which means asking people, interviewing people, providing space for storytelling rather than sort of presenting a list of questions as a survey. So I wanted to allow student voices, plural, because student voice is not singular, student voices to tell me how they define student mental health and well-being and how they map it in terms of their own experiences. So I used narrative interviews and what I called social media elicitation, whereby I asked students to choose social media posts which to them meant their mental health and well-being as a student at the time of posting. And I asked them to tell me the story behind the post, not of the post itself, but what was going on, what's the story, the little stories underneath that, in a narrative interview. And I didn't have a pre-designed set of questions. I wanted the students to lay the agenda out in terms of their understanding of their student mental health and well-being. So yeah, it was more about, who are these students? Right? Student is a label and it's a role that a person takes on for a limited amount of time. So where's the person in this student capacity, and consequently, how do they understand their mental health in that role? And I wanted to learn from stories.
I'm tempted to just ask the big, broad brushstroke question of what did you learn? But I think we'll be here for about another 4 hours ourselves, because it's clearly really, really rich
Very
research
rich data.
and very rich data. So I guess we need to get to the nub of it. What were the key points that you took away about student mental health and I guess broader mental health within academic institutions?
Essentially, there's a 3-part way of understanding my thesis. And the first part, the students talked about where mental health and well-being in general fitted in their general life. in relation to things like time and loss and place and space and things like this. The second strand was where they specifically mentioned university elements, and that included relationships, university systems, perceptions, even getting down to the idea of it being almost not normal if you're not experiencing distress as a student, which is an interesting thing to think about. How mental ill health in students might actually be considered normal or talked about as normal.
Normal among students?
Normal among students.
Right.
Yeah. So that was one element which I did find a little bit interesting, which needs a bit more unpacking. But perhaps the main kind of the common undercurrents of both of the general life and the university life together in a person who happens to be a student was about their emotions and their framing of mental health in terms of 3 specific emotional tenets, which is feeling in control, feeling secure, and feeling recognised. So in terms of feeling in control, it's about student agency, feeling restricted or controlled by or even powerless in relation to some university systems and mechanisms, or even to the point of describing, this happened quite a few times, describing student mental wellness in a way as being a matter of luck. My mental health's good because I got lucky in my accommodation. My mental health's good because I was lucky I got that supervisor. So almost suggesting that mental health and well-being might not necessarily be a matter of personal control, but about extrinsic luck. The feeling secure element I found particularly interesting and particularly relevant in our current societal context, because it was stories that were about a desire to be both internally and externally secure whilst at university. And what came through was that an increasing idea of going to university as being something inherently risky to do. They have high hopes of university as sort of these bastions of career, security. It's a pillar, it's a focus point, it's really grounded. And then going into a university context where that idea of university is secure is actually quite challenged. And they're not guaranteed things. And things become a roller coaster that they need to stabilise. So that was the second kind of feeling strand. And then the third one was about feeling recognised, which was essentially about how, as an individual, the student feels they are acknowledged, can be crucial to their mapping of their mental health and well-being as a student. And conveyed was this kind of assessment of institutions as lacking in appreciation of students' lived realities, like having to work all the hours, like cost of living, like all of these kind of societal pressures, as those actually being about where their mental health is, not necessarily about assessments all the time. And I think I just want to share one quote. I'm not going to swear, as the student did. Okay, I shall bleep it out myself. But the quote that was particularly impactful, I think, was she said, "I think saying student mental health is a bit expletive, because it sort of makes it sound like we're not people. This is mental health. You are a person, not a student or a number or a statistic." And I think that was a really important part of the thesis, to sort of say student mental health is not necessarily about this idea of illness or anything like that, but, you know, about relationships and about the level of agency that you have and the level of security you have, all of these kind of emotion things coming together in a very symbolic, meaningful, felt experience that is university. And that's what's important to kind of think about when you want to know or understand mental health and well-being for students.
How difficult have you found it in your experience for universities to acknowledge the complexity of what's going on with student mental health?
It's a really complicated question. They do acknowledge it. That's the thing. It's not that it's not being discussed. It's working out. I suppose in many respects, when you're talking about mental health in universities, it's not actually about mental health in itself. It's more about the institutions, the sector, not really being in a position to be able to engage in these conversations because of external pressures. So what is at the operational level in reference to discussions about student and even now staff mental health is kind of this visible result of filtering down from the top in a difficult sector experience. I suppose drawing on my first PhD to do with the BBC, you have a public service ethos, yes? And the programmes that are produced at the bottom are designed to be visible evidence of that public serviceness. So when you're looking at the staff-student interactions and the staff and student mental health related or experiences or mental distress, it's a filtering down of what's going on at a bigger level, which isn't necessarily about mental health on its own. Universities as workplaces are also needing sort of amplification, understanding as being comprised of individuals themselves, some of whom are also coming to their work very passionate about their work because of very impactful living experiences. So if the university workers are not supported or afforded time and care or security themselves to be able to engage in honest conversations about mental health and experiences of distress on the part of students as well themselves, then you're going to struggle with meaningful change, developments that are for the better, specifically in relation to that issue.
Heather, I mean, this has been a particularly academic edition of Speaking of Suicide, hasn't it? We've got into the guts of some of this, and it feels to me a bit like we've gone and unpacked a whole big box of mess and complication with regard to student mental health. But what we usually try and do with this series is give someone a bit of an olive branch or a beacon of hope at the end for them to take away. And I'm not sure we've done that so much with this. And so if you had a student going up to university or college now, what should we be handing them in terms of, are the resources? What is the support? What do we say in terms of hope? Because it feels like quite a bleak, difficult picture.
It has to be acknowledged that the UK HE sector, because of the redundancies, precarity, all the rest of it, is in a difficult situation. What I will say is there are very, very many people in academic settings who really care and who are working very hard to make changes to ensure that students are supported as well as their colleagues are supported. There is a lot of kind of, not necessarily through formal channels, but there are a lot of really open conversations that are happening amongst people to really make sure that everybody has the experience that is the best for them. There's a lot of kind of signposting to the right places. There's a lot of reviewing what support there is, what we can do. There is research going on in relation to student mental health that is very well organised, very well conducted. It is not something that no one really is not bothered about. There is high recognition that this is important, and it's not a case of saying universities don't care. Oh, there's a lot of us who do, and those of us who do will continue to make those points and voice that concern to try and push it further.
It seems to be clear from talking to you that Martin's very sad death back in 2011, that since then you've been on this journey of picking it apart and understanding it through your research, and that's obviously your way of it's part of your bereavement, I expect.
Yeah, I do think when Martin died, there was a university lecturer of his who came to see the family, and she mentioned that her view of him had been that he wasn't actually pessimistic, but rather optimistic. Not necessarily that he was hopeful, but that he had a very strong belief in the potential of humans and humanity, and that we could and can do better if we choose to. And in some ways, I kind of like to think that I would take on a bit of his bolshiness and a bit more of his kind of, I'm going to raise a lot of questions and pose difficult ones to people in order to get people to meet me halfway. I don't want to come up with answers, and I don't want to be I want to focus on the bereavement experience and somebody else to take on the preventative side of things. But that's kind of my approach. I want to just illuminate certain details that people will not see unless they have the experience themselves, in order to just maybe encourage people to think a little bit more in some of the decisions that they make or some of the actions that they take, in whatever context that may be.
Heather, it has been fascinating talking to you, for speaking of suicide. Thank you for being so open and sharing your research and your story. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was talking to Dr. Heather Sutherland, a lecturer at St John's University in York. Now, here's Shona from Mikey's Line with a few thoughts to take away from my conversation with Heather.
I was so struck by Heather's care in her use of language, particularly her reframing the language of having a lived experience of suicide, that kind of past tense way of speaking, to having a living experience. And just that shift in tense, I think has massive impact. The way that we think, the way that we speak to ourselves is affected by language. So by making that shift, it's so helpful, and it's moving away from this very unhelpful overculture narrative about moving on from grief being something that we get over, and rather reflecting just what a living experience of grief, something that's never finished, something that's alive, a much more healthy way to think about it. And then similarly, the way she talks about her relationship with Martin, they never said goodbye to each other, and she has framed her relationship with Martin that it hasn't ended with his death, that rather she's still in relationship with him and in conversation with him in her daily life. Something that's, I think, reflected in her work and her research about students' living experience of mental health. And then the other thing I'm struck with Heather is her ability to frame helpful and courageous questions, both inner questions to herself about things like, am I a sister or not? And do I want to talk about my living experience of suicide today? And sort of bigger cultural questions about how can we think of grief with a longer term lens? Is it post-traumatic stress disorder in her case, or actually was it a disorder because it seemed like such a healthy way for the body to try and process something that is so hard to process? And questions to institutions like educational institutions about how can we do a better job here. And when we lose someone to suicide, over and over again, we hear people living with very painful questions that they can never get an answer for. The answer, their loved one who's died by suicide might not even know the answer to that. And we can get sort of stuck in a very painful loop. And I love Heather's modelling of asking and living different, compassionate, helpful questions. A poet, Rilke, has a beautiful quote: "Live the questions now. Perhaps then someday in the future you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way to the answer." So please don't be alone with whatever questions you are living or struggling with right now. No one will have all the answers, but having a listening ear can make all the difference in you not feeling alone or as alone in this. So please reach out to someone you trust, or reach out to Mikey's Line. We're there for you.
So if you do need someone to talk to or some help, the text for Mikey's Line is 07786 20 77 55, or you can contact them via Messenger, web chat and WhatsApp. The number for WhatsApp is 01463 729 000. Or of course, if you're in the Highlands, you can go and visit them. They are at The Hive, 4 Struthers Lane, Inverness, and they're open 7 days a week from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m, and all those details and links are in the show notes. Speaking of Suicide is funded by Mikey's Line, and the platform is sponsored by Highland-based family firm D&D Paving Limited. If you'd like to sponsor an episode, do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Or, of course, if you'd like to share your story. Speaking of Suicide is produced by Adventurous Audio Limited.